October 12, 1943. 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura's hands trembled as he gripped the controls of his Mitsubishi A6 M50. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cockpit, as his formation of 12 elite pilots maintained their heading toward what intelligence had promised would be an easy target: a lone American carrier group with minimal fighter protection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Through his canopy, Nakamura spotted them first: 6 dark silhouettes climbing steadily from the carrier deck below. But these weren't the familiar profiles of the Wildcats his squadron had dominated for 2 years. These aircraft were different. Larger, more robust. The distinctive bent-wing design and powerful radial engines marked them as the new American fighters that had been whispered about in intelligence briefings: F6F Hellcats. What happened in the next 17 minutes would fundamentally alter Japanese naval aviation doctrine and send shockwaves through the highest levels of the Imperial Navy. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, an entire squadron of Japan's most experienced pilots would return to their carrier, not in triumph, but in defeat so complete that it would trigger the most classified order in Japanese military history. The encounter began like countless others before it. Nakamura's squadron, composed entirely of veterans with a combined total of over 300 aerial victories, executed their standard attack formation. The Zero's legendary maneuverability had made them masters of the Pacific skies since December 1941. Every pilot in the formation had personally witnessed American fighters breaking off engagements rather than risk a turning fight with their nimble aircraft. But as the two formations closed, something unprecedented occurred. The Hellcats didn't attempt to flee. They didn't climb away to safety. Instead, they turned directly into the attacking Zeros, their powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines pulling them through maneuvers that should have been impossible for such heavy aircraft. Within minutes, the mathematical certainties of aerial combat that had favored Japanese pilots for nearly 2 years were being systematically dismantled. The Hellcats matched every turn, countered every tactical advantage, and when the engagement moved into vertical maneuvers, the American fighters demonstrated a climb rate that left the Zero struggling to maintain contact. By the time Nakamura ordered his surviving pilots to disengage, 3 of Japan's finest aviators had been shot down. 4 more aircraft had sustained critical damage, and the psychological foundation upon which Japanese air superiority rested had been shattered. The Americans hadn't just won an engagement, they had revealed that the era of Zero dominance was ending. The roots of this transformation stretched back 18 months to a converted automobile factory in Stratford, Connecticut, where Grumman Aircraft Corporation had been quietly developing what would become the most successful carrier-based fighter of World War II. The project began not with revolutionary design concepts, but with the systematic analysis of every combat report filed by American pilots who had faced the Zero in battle. Roy Grumman, the company's founder and chief engineer, had spent the early months of 1942 poring over intelligence reports from the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and countless smaller engagements across the Pacific. What emerged was a clear picture of the Zero's strengths and, more importantly, its limitations. The Japanese fighter excelled in turning combat and could outmaneuver any American aircraft in service. Teams discovered that while the Zero could outturn any Allied fighter, its performance degraded rapidly at higher altitudes. The aircraft's lightweight construction, while providing maneuverability, made it vulnerable to concentrated firepower. Most critically, the Zero's engine power was insufficient for sustained high-speed flight,
particularly in vertical maneuvers where American fighters could potentially gain advantage. These insights drove the development philosophy behind what would become the F6F Hellcat. Rather than attempting to match the Zero's turning ability, Grumman engineers focused on creating an aircraft that could nullify the Japanese fighter's advantages while exploiting its weaknesses. The result was a design philosophy that prioritized performance characteristics where American industrial capabilities could provide decisive advantages. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower, compared to the Zero's 1,130 horsepower Nakajima Sakai radial. This power advantage translated into superior performance at high altitudes, faster climb rates, and the ability to maintain high speeds in sustained combat. Where the Zero relied on finesse, the Hellcat would employ brute force. Grumman's engineers also addressed the armor protection that had been sacrificed in previous American fighter designs. The Hellcat incorporated comprehensive pilot protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant control systems. This robust construction philosophy reflected American industrial thinking: build aircraft sturdy enough to absorb battle damage and return pilots safely to their carriers. The development process accelerated throughout 1942 as combat reports continued to reveal the extent of Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. Admiral John McCain, commander of Task Force 38, had personally requested an expedited development schedule after witnessing the devastating effectiveness of Zero fighters during the Guadalcanal campaign. By early 1943, prototype Hellcats were undergoing intensive testing at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland. Test pilots pushed the aircraft through maneuvers that replicated combat conditions reported from the Pacific Theater. The results exceeded expectations. The Hellcat could match the Zero's performance in most flight regimes while maintaining decisive advantages in high-altitude combat and high-speed engagements. Commander David McCampbell, who would later become the Navy's leading ace, participated in early tactical development flights. His reports emphasized the Hellcat's ability to dictate engagement terms, something that had been impossible with earlier American fighters. If conditions favored the Hellcat, pilots could press attacks. If circumstances were unfavorable, the aircraft's superior speed and climb rate allowed for disengagement and repositioning. This tactical flexibility represented a fundamental shift in Pacific air combat dynamics. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots would possess an aircraft capable of engaging Zero fighters on equal or superior terms. The psychological impact of this capability would prove as significant as its tactical advantages. Production planning for the Hellcat reflected American industrial advantages that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. Grumman's Bethpage facility was retooled for high-rate production using assembly line techniques pioneered in automotive manufacturing. The company's production engineers designed manufacturing processes that could produce Hellcats at rates impossible for Japanese industry to match. While Japanese aircraft factories relied heavily on skilled craftsmen building individual aircraft, Grumman implemented standardized assembly procedures that allowed less experienced workers to contribute to production. This approach reflected broader American industrial philosophy: achieve quality through consistent processes rather than individual expertise. The first production Hellcats rolled off Grumman's assembly lines in October 1942. But extensive testing delayed operational deployment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Until early 1943, Navy leadership, mindful of the disasters that had befallen hastily deployed aircraft earlier in the war, insisted on comprehensive testing before approving the Hellcat for combat operations. Test pilots flew thousands of hours evaluating the aircraft's performance across all flight regimes. Engine reliability received particular attention after mechanical failures had plagued earlier American fighters in Pacific conditions. The R2800 engine proved remarkably robust, maintaining performance even after extended high-power operations in tropical environments. Armament testing confirmed the Hellcat's devastating firepower advantage over the Zero.
6.50 caliber machine guns provided twice the firepower of the Zero's two 20mm cannons and two machine guns. More importantly, the American weapons maintained consistent accuracy across all flight attitudes, while the Zero's cannons were effective only within narrow firing parameters. By spring 1943, Navy fighter squadrons were transitioning from Wildcats to Hellcats at training facilities across the United States. Pilot conversion training emphasized tactics specifically designed to exploit the new aircraft's advantages while avoiding situations where Zero fighters might retain superiority. The tactical doctrine that emerged from this training revolutionized American fighter operations in the Pacific. Previous American fighters had been forced to employ defensive tactics, avoiding engagements unless conditions overwhelmingly favored American pilots. The Hellcat allowed offensive operations that could actively seek combat with Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, already a recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions in a Wildcat, was among the first experienced pilots to transition to the Hellcat. His evaluation reports praised the aircraft's ability to maintain combat effectiveness across a wide range of tactical situations. Where the Wildcat had required careful positioning and tactical patience, the Hellcat could engage aggressively and recover from tactical mistakes through superior performance. Training scenarios replicated the turning fights that had characterized Pacific air combat, but Hellcat pilots learned to avoid prolonged horizontal maneuvering where Zero fighters maintained advantages. Instead, they practiced tactics that utilized the Hellcat's superior power and climb rate to control engagement geometry and dictate combat terms. The fundamental tactical approach centered on energy management principles that had been largely theoretical in earlier American fighters. Hellcat pilots learned to use their aircraft's superior power to gain and maintain energy advantages that could be converted into tactical positions. This represented a sophisticated evolution from the predominantly defensive tactics that had characterized American fighter operations since Pearl Harbor. As production accelerated and pilot training expanded, Japanese intelligence remained largely unaware of the transformation occurring in American naval aviation. Isolated reports of new American fighters had reached Japanese analysts, but the fragmentary nature of this intelligence prevented comprehensive evaluation of the threat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had received scattered reports of improved American aircraft, but these were dismissed in the context of Japan's continued air superiority across the Pacific. Japanese pilots continued achieving favorable kill ratios against American fighters, reinforcing confidence in existing tactics and aircraft. This intelligence failure reflected broader Japanese misconceptions about American industrial capabilities. Japanese planners had consistently underestimated American ability to rapidly develop and deploy new technologies. The assumption that American aircraft development followed Japanese timelines would prove catastrophically incorrect. By summer 1943, the first Hellcat squadrons were deploying to Pacific carriers, but their initial operations were carefully managed to prevent premature exposure of the aircraft's capabilities.
Understood that tactical surprise would multiply the Hellcat's advantages, so early deployments focused on situations where contact with elite Japanese units was unlikely. VF-5, the first squadron to receive Hellcats, operated from USS Yorktown during operations against lightly defended Japanese positions in the Central Pacific. These initial missions allowed pilots to gain combat experience with the new aircraft, while avoiding encounters with veteran Japanese units that might provide intelligence about American capabilities. The squadron's commander, Lieutenant Commander Charles Cromland, maintained strict operational security regarding the Hellcat's performance characteristics. Pilots were briefed on the importance of preventing Japanese forces from capturing intact aircraft or obtaining detailed information about the fighter's capabilities. This operational security extended to combat reporting, where Hellcat encounters were often attributed to other aircraft types in official communications. The deception campaign aimed to delay Japanese recognition of the threat until American forces could deploy sufficient numbers of Hellcats to achieve decisive tactical advantages. Meanwhile, Japanese naval aviation continued operating under assumptions that had been valid throughout 1942 but were rapidly becoming obsolete. Training programs still emphasized the turning fight tactics that had proven so effective against Wildcats. Equipment development focused on incremental improvements to existing aircraft rather than revolutionary advances that might counter emerging American capabilities. The A6M50 variant that entered service in late 1943 incorporated minor improvements to engine power and structural strength, but these modifications were insufficient to address the fundamental performance gaps that the Hellcat would exploit. Japanese engineers, working within resource constraints imposed by Japan's strategic situation, could not match the comprehensive redesign that had produced the Hellcat. Japanese pilot training also reflected the overconfidence that had developed from 2 years of air superiority. New pilots received extensive instruction in aggressive tactics that had proven successful against earlier American fighters, but little attention was devoted to defensive procedures that might be necessary against improved enemy aircraft. This training philosophy reflected broader Japanese military culture that emphasized offensive spirit over defensive preparation. The possibility that American aircraft might soon match or exceed zero performance was considered unlikely by most Japanese aviation leaders, creating a dangerous blind spot in tactical preparation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Pacific air combat. American carriers equipped with Hellcats were moving toward Japanese-controlled waters, while Japanese squadrons prepared for what they expected would be another series of victories against inferior American aircraft. The mathematical certainties that had governed air combat for nearly 2 years were about to be recalculated by more powerful engines, heavier armor, and concentrated firepower. The elegant maneuverability that had made the Zero master of Pacific skies would soon confront the brute force engineering that represented American industrial advantages. On October 11, 1943, as Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's squadron prepared for what intelligence had indicated would be a routine engagement with American carrier aircraft, the most experienced Japanese pilots in the Pacific were about to discover that the rules of aerial warfare had fundamentally changed. The aircraft approaching from the American carrier decks represented more than improved technology. They embodied a comprehensive rethinking of fighter aircraft design that would challenge every assumption upon which Japanese air superiority rested. The encounter that would unfold the following morning would mark the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation dominance, though neither
side yet understood the historical significance of the forces now converging above the Solomon Islands. The age of the Zero was ending, and with it, Japan's ability to control the skies over the vast Pacific battlefield where the war's outcome would ultimately be determined. The morning of October 12th began with routine preparations aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku as Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's squadron conducted final briefings for what promised to be another successful strike against American naval forces. Weather conditions were optimal, with clear skies and favorable winds that would allow maximum performance from their Zero fighters. Intelligence reports indicated minimal American fighter protection, suggesting an opportunity to inflict significant damage with minimal losses. Nakamura reviewed the tactical plan with his flight leaders, emphasizing the coordinated attack patterns that had proven so effective in previous engagements. The squadron's 12 aircraft represented some of Japan's most experienced pilots, with individual victory totals ranging from 15 to 38 confirmed kills. Their collective expertise embodied 2 years of combat evolution that had refined Japanese fighter tactics to devastating efficiency. As the Zeros launched from Shokaku's flight deck, their pilots carried with them the confidence born of consistent victory. The mathematical principles governing air combat seemed immutable. Lighter aircraft possessed inherent advantages in maneuverability. Experienced pilots could exploit these advantages to achieve favorable positions, and concentrated attacks could overwhelm numerically superior but tactically inferior opponents. The American carrier group that morning presented what appeared to be an ideal target. The USS Essex, operating with minimal escort vessels, had been conducting flight operations in waters that Japanese intelligence considered well within their sphere of control. 6 Hellcats had launched as combat air patrol, a number that seemed insufficient to provide effective defense against 12 veteran Zero pilots. As the two formations approached each other at a combined closing speed exceeding 500 miles per hour, both sides initiated their standard tactical procedures. The Japanese pilots began their characteristic climb to gain altitude advantage, while the American formation maintained level flight at 18,000 feet, forcing the Japanese aircraft into increasingly desperate maneuvers. When Zeros attempted their traditional diving attacks, Hellcats climbed to meet them, negating the altitude advantage that had been fundamental to Japanese tactics. Nakamura found himself in a situation he had never encountered during 2 years of combat. His Zero, despite being handled by one of Japan's most skilled pilots, could not gain a decisive positional advantage over the American fighters. Every tactical maneuver that had previously guaranteed success was being countered by American aircraft that matched or exceeded his performance across multiple flight regimes. The engagement's first casualty came when Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe, a veteran pilot with 23 confirmed victories, attempted a high-speed diving attack that had been his signature maneuver throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. As his Zero approached maximum dive speed, Davidson's Hellcat intercepted the attack angle with a climbing turn that brought the American fighter's 6.50 caliber machine guns to bear at optimal range. The concentrated firepower that erupted from the Hellcat represented another fundamental shift in air combat dynamics. Where previous American fighters had relied on single .50 caliber or .30 caliber weapons that required sustained firing to inflict critical damage, the Hellcat's 6 heavy machine guns could destroy enemy aircraft with short, precise bursts. Watanabe's Zero disintegrated under the impact of multiple armor-piercing rounds that penetrated the aircraft's lightly constructed fuselage and ignited its unprotected fuel tanks. The psychological impact of witnessing such devastating firepower applied against one of their most experienced pilots sent shockwaves through the Japanese formation. For 2 years, Zero pilots had grown accustomed to absorbing hits from American fighters and continuing combat. The idea that a single burst could completely destroy their aircraft challenged fundamental assumptions about combat survivability. As the engagement continued, more Japanese tactical certainties began to crumble. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, attempting to use his Zero's turning ability to gain position on a Hellcat, found that the American aircraft could match his turns while maintaining higher speeds and better energy retention. When Tanaka attempted to extend the turning fight where Zero advantages should have become decisive, the Hellcat pilot simply used his superior power to climb out of the engagement and reset for another attack. This tactical flexibility represented perhaps the most significant advantage that the Hellcat provided to American pilots. Where earlier American fighters had been forced to commit to tactical decisions that often proved disadvantageous, Hellcat pilots could adapt their approach based on developing circumstances. If a particular attack didn't develop favorably, they possessed the performance to disengage and try alternative approaches. The Japanese pilots, trained in tactics that emphasized commitment to the attack and aggressive pursuit of advantages, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by American fighters that could dictate engagement terms. Every time a Zero pilot gained what seemed to be a favorable position, the target Hellcat would use its superior performance to negate the advantage and create new tactical problems for the Japanese formation. By the engagement's midpoint, the mathematical certainties that had governed air combat since Pearl Harbor were being systematically demolished. 3 Zero pilots had been shot down, including 2 veterans with more than 20 victories each. 4 more Japanese aircraft had sustained significant damage while the American formation remained intact and continued pressing coordinated attacks. Nakamura, recognizing that his squadron was facing a situation beyond their tactical training, attempted to implement emergency procedures designed for encounters with superior numbers of enemy aircraft. He ordered his remaining pilots to execute a coordinated withdrawal using mutual cover tactics that had proven effective against American bombers. But the Hellcats possessed sufficient performance to maintain contact with the retreating Zeros while continuing to apply offensive pressure. The withdrawal attempt revealed another critical advantage that the Hellcat provided to American forces. Previous American fighters had possessed insufficient performance to pursue Japanese aircraft that chose to disengage from combat. This limitation had allowed Zero pilots to control engagement duration, withdrawing whenever circumstances became unfavorable and returning when conditions improved. The Hellcats demonstrated that this tactical option no longer existed for Japanese pilots. When Zeros attempted to disengage, the American fighters could maintain pursuit while continuing to inflict damage. This capability transformed the entire psychology of air combat, as Japanese pilots could no longer rely on their ability to escape from disadvantageous situations. As Nakamura's formation struggled to execute their withdrawal, Davidson's Hellcats continued applying coordinated pressure that prevented the Japanese aircraft from gaining the separation necessary for successful disengagement. The American pilots had been trained in pursuit tactics specifically designed to exploit their aircraft's performance advantages, maintaining attack pressure while preventing enemy aircraft from regaining tactical initiative. The engagement's final phase demonstrated the cumulative impact of American tactical and technological advantages. 2 more Zeros were shot down during the attempted withdrawal, including Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamada, a squadron leader with 31 confirmed victories whose loss represented an irreplaceable depletion of Japanese pilot experience. When Nakamura finally managed to extract his surviving aircraft from the engagement, his squadron had suffered losses that exceeded any single combat in their collective experience. Of 12 aircraft that had launched that morning with complete confidence in their tactical superiority, only 7 returned to Shokoku. More significantly, every surviving pilot had experienced a fundamental challenge to their understanding of air combat dynamics. The debriefing aboard Shokoku that evening reflected the psychological trauma that accompanied the tactical defeat. Veteran pilots who had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years found themselves struggling to explain how American fighters had negated every advantage that had previously guaranteed Japanese success. The reports they filed would initiate a chain of analysis that would ultimately reach the highest levels of Japanese naval command.
Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations from Pearl Harbor, had anticipated that the Hellcats' combat debut would provide tactical advantages, but the extent of Japanese tactical disruption exceeded even optimistic projections. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese units were beginning to avoid engagements with American fighters, a behavioral change that suggested profound psychological impact beyond the immediate tactical advantages. The psychological transformation occurring within Japanese naval aviation reflected deeper changes in the Pacific War's strategic balance. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had possessed aircraft that could consistently defeat American opponents, providing air superiority that enabled successful execution of broader naval operations. The loss of this advantage threatened Japan's ability to maintain defensive positions across their extended Pacific empire. By November 1943, the cumulative impact of Hellcat deployments was becoming apparent through intelligence analysis conducted by both sides. American code-breaking operations revealed Japanese communications discussing the new American fighter problem and requesting priority development of countermeasures. These intercepts confirmed that Japanese leadership recognized the strategic significance of American technological achievements. Vice Admiral Mark Mitster, commanding Task Force 58, used intelligence about Japanese tactical confusion to plan operations that would maximize the Hellcats' psychological impact. Instead of gradually introducing the new fighters, Mitster concentrated Hellcat squadrons from major operations designed to overwhelm Japanese air defenses and demonstrate American air superiority across broad areas of the Pacific. The November 20th assault on Tarawa represented the first large-scale deployment of Hellcat squadrons against major Japanese defensive positions. 8 squadrons operating from 6 carriers provided air support for the amphibious landings while engaging Japanese aircraft defending the atoll. The results confirmed that individual tactical advantages observed in smaller engagements could be scaled to achieve strategic air superiority. Japanese defenders at Tarawa had prepared for the assault by concentrating their most experienced pilots and latest aircraft variants. The defensive plan called for coordinated attacks against American carriers, using tactics that had proven successful throughout 1942 and early 1943.
But when Japanese formations encountered the concentrated Hellcat squadrons, the tactical dynamics that had characterized previous engagements were magnified to devastating effect. Over 3 days of intense air combat around Tarawa, Japanese naval aviation lost 78 aircraft while shooting down only 19 American fighters. The kill ratio, heavily favoring American forces for the first time in the Pacific War, represented a fundamental shift in combat dynamics that Japanese commanders could no longer dismiss as isolated incidents. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots, participated in the Tarawa defense and filed reports that captured the psychological impact of confronting superior American aircraft. His descriptions of Hellcat performance characteristics matched intelligence estimates, but emphasized the tactical helplessness that Japanese pilots experienced when facing coordinated American formations. Sakai's analysis identified specific tactical situations where Japanese aircraft retained advantages, primarily in low-speed turning fights at altitudes below 10,000 feet. However, he noted that Hellcat pilots had learned to avoid these situations while exploiting their aircraft's advantages in high-speed and high-altitude combat. This tactical discipline represented a maturation of American fighter doctrine that matched technological improvements. The strategic implications of American air superiority became apparent as 1943 concluded and planning began for 1944 operations. Japanese defensive positions that had been considered impregnable when
protected by Zero fighters were now vulnerable to sustained American air attack. The loss of reliable air superiority threatened Japan's ability to maintain their Pacific defensive perimeter. Emperor Hirohito received briefings in December 1943 that outlined the deteriorating situation in naval aviation. The reports acknowledged that American technological advantages had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific War. Japanese aircraft production, already constrained by resource limitations, could not match American output of superior fighters within timeframes necessary to prevent further territorial losses. The response within Japanese military leadership varied between denial and desperate attempts to develop countermeasures. Some commanders continued believing that superior Japanese pilot training and tactical innovation could overcome American technological advantages. Others recognized that the material balance had shifted decisively against Japan and began advocating defensive strategies designed to maximize the cost of American advances. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his reputation for aggressive tactics, privately acknowledged that Japanese naval aviation faced challenges that could not be resolved through traditional approaches. His communications with fleet commanders emphasized the need for tactical adaptation while accelerating development programs for new aircraft that might restore competitive balance. The A-7M Ripu fighter program, intended to replace the Zero with an aircraft capable of matching American performance, received maximum priority allocation of resources and engineering talent. However, development timelines indicated that improved Japanese fighters would not reach operational units before mid-1945, a schedule that might prove too late to affect the war's outcome. Meanwhile, American Hellcat production continued accelerating beyond Japanese ability to monitor or counter. Grumman's Bethpage facility was producing more than 600 aircraft monthly by early 1944, while Japanese factories struggled to maintain production of 200 Zero variants during the same period. This production disparity meant that American numerical advantages would compound technological superiority. The training pipeline for American Hellcat pilots also reflected industrial advantages that Japanese military planners had consistently underestimated. Advanced training programs in the United States were producing combat-ready pilots faster than Japan could replace experienced aviators lost in increasingly unfavorable combat exchanges. By March 1944, the cumulative impact of these advantages was becoming apparent through operational analysis. Japanese air units that had maintained offensive capability throughout 1942 and 1943 were being forced into purely defensive roles as American forces advanced across the Central Pacific. The loss of air superiority meant that Japanese naval operations required defensive fighter coverage that had previously been available for offensive missions. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots continued intensifying as encounters with Hellcats became routine rather than exceptional. Veteran pilots who had achieved ace status against American Wildcats found themselves struggling to survive combat against the new American fighters. This reversal of fortune affected morale throughout Japanese naval aviation and contributed to declining combat effectiveness that extended beyond individual engagements. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding Japanese carrier forces, issued tactical guidance in April 1944 that represented a fundamental change in Japanese naval aviation doctrine. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots were instructed to avoid engagement with American fighters unless circumstances provided overwhelming advantage. This defensive posture acknowledged that Japanese aircraft could no longer compete effectively against American technological superiority. The directive that emerged from these tactical reassessments would later be known as Special Order 7741, though its classification level prevented widespread distribution even within Japanese naval aviation units. The order instructed squadron commanders to avoid engagements with identified F6F Hellcat formations unless tactical conditions provided at least 3-to-1 numerical superiority and favorable altitude positioning. Special Order 7741 represented the most significant acknowledgement of American air superiority since the beginning of the Pacific War. By instructing their most experienced pilots to avoid combat with American fighters, Japanese Naval Command was effectively conceding control of Pacific airspace to American forces. The psychological impact of this admission would prove as significant as its tactical implications. The order's implementation required fundamental changes to Japanese operational planning. Air operations that had previously assumed Japanese fighter superiority now had to account for American air dominance. This constraint affected every aspect of Japanese naval operations, from convoy protection to amphibious assault support, forcing adoption of defensive strategies that reduced overall operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, whose October encounter with Hellcats had contributed to the intelligence picture leading to Special Order 7741, found himself training new pilots in defensive tactics that contradicted everything he had learned during 2 years of air superiority. The psychological difficulty of teaching evasion and survival rather than aggressive attack reflected broader demoralization affecting Japanese naval aviation. The impact of American air superiority extended beyond tactical aviation to affect Japanese strategic planning for the war's continuation. Operations that depended on reliable air cover became increasingly risky, while American forces gained freedom of movement that enabled accelerated advance across the Pacific. The loss of air superiority was transforming Japan's strategic position from offensive capability to desperate defense. Admiral King, commanding American naval operations, recognized that the Hellcat had provided advantages that extended beyond individual combat effectiveness. The psychological impact of consistent American air superiority was affecting Japanese decision-making at strategic levels, creating opportunities for operations that would have been impossible under conditions of contested airspace. The June 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the culmination of American air superiority established through Hellcat deployment. Japanese naval aviation, operating under the constraints of Special Order 7741, found themselves unable to execute coordinated attacks against American carrier forces. The resulting engagement,
known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the strategic consequences of tactical air superiority. Over 2 days of combat, American Hellcat squadrons destroyed more than 400 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 American fighters. The kill ratios achieved during this engagement exceeded even optimistic projections and effectively ended Japanese carrier-based aviation as an effective fighting force. The mathematical principles that had governed air combat since 1941 had been completely rewritten by American technological and industrial advantages. Japanese pilot training programs, faced with accelerating loss rates and declining aircraft availability, began emphasizing survival over aggressive attack. New pilots received instruction in evasion techniques and defensive maneuvering rather than the offensive tactics that had characterized earlier training. This fundamental shift reflected the transformed strategic situation where Japanese aviation served primarily defensive functions. The industrial statistics underlying these tactical changes painted a clear picture of American advantages that Japanese planners could no longer ignore. Grumman was producing Hellcats at rates exceeding total Japanese fighter production across all manufacturers. This quantitative advantage combined with qualitative superiority meant that Japan was unable to replace aircraft lost in combat at a sustained rate.
Created an imbalance the Japanese industrial capacity could not address within relevant timeframes. By August 1944, Special Order 7741 had evolved into broader tactical doctrine that affected all Japanese air operations in the Pacific theater. Squadron commanders routinely avoided engagement with American fighters unless circumstances provided overwhelming advantage. This defensive posture, while reducing immediate losses, effectively conceded air superiority across vast areas of the Pacific where American forces operated with impunity. The psychological transformation of Japanese naval aviation from offensive superiority to defensive survival represented one of the Pacific War's most significant strategic shifts. The F6F Hellcat had provided American forces with technological advantages that Japanese industry and tactical innovation could not counter within the timeframes necessary to affect the war's outcome. American intelligence analysts monitoring Japanese communications and tactical behavior recognized that the Hellcat had achieved strategic impact beyond its designer's original intentions. By forcing Japanese aviation into defensive roles, the aircraft had enabled American operational freedom that accelerated the pace of Pacific advances and shortened the war's duration. The legacy of Special Order 7741 extended beyond its immediate tactical impact to influence Japanese strategic thinking about technological competition with American industrial capacity. The order represented acknowledgement that Japan could not match American material advantages through superior training or tactical innovation, a recognition that affected Japanese planning for the war's continuation and eventual conclusion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.